Well, welcome everybody. It's nice to see your shining faces.
Where's Colita this morning?
I gave her a really big job at the last minute and she's working on it at church.
I bet she's happy, huh?
Well, what had happened was Monica was not able to do the newsletter this month. They've had a lot of extra things going on and she was going to take it over. So Monica asked for an extra month. She had done some of it already. And newsletter was supposed to come out last weekend, so I said, well, Colita, we really need it by Sunday. So she's been cranking out the newsletter for the last couple days. So and I think she's making copies now, so she's basically done putting it together. So yeah, it's because I'm a mean boss. That's what it is. Wait, that's why Colita's not here, because I'm a mean boss. Deadlines and stuff. We are on chapter 14, verse 53. We are now deep into well, we're starting all the arrest just happened, the arrest of Jesus just happened, and we're going into all of that. And in Mark, it happens really quickly. In the other gospels, there's a little bit more that happens between, but all of the there's I guess there's less events between the time of the arrest and the crucifixion in Mark than other places. So we're at 53. They took Jesus to the high priest, and all the chief priests, the elders, and the scribes were assembled. Peter had followed him at a distance right into the courtyard of the high priest, and he was sitting with the guards warming himself at the fire. Now the chief priests and the whole council were looking for testimony against Jesus to put him to death, but they found none. For many gave false testimony against him, and their testimony did not agree. Some stood up and gave false testimony against him, saying, we heard him say, I will destroy this temple that is made with hands, and in 3 days I will build another not made with hands. But even on this point, their testimony did not agree. Then the high priest stood up before them and asked Jesus, have you no answer? What is it that they testify against you? But he was silent and did not answer. Again, the high priest asked him, are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One? Jesus said, I am. And you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven. Then the high priest tore his clothes and said, why do we still need witnesses? You have heard his blasphemy. What is your decision? All of them condemned him as deserving death. Some began to spit on him, to blindfold him, and to strike him, saying to him, prophesy. The guards also took him over and beat him.
That's a really depressing passage for me.
How many times during the trials and crucifixion was Jesus whipped or beaten? Several? At least 3 that I can count?
2 or 3.
This is the first.
Yeah.
And the guards did, or Pilate asked him to be whipped. And
well, and it depends, because some gospels have parts that aren't other places. But yeah, there's a few times. I find, one thing I find interesting is at no point did Jesus openly say, even to his disciples, I am the Messiah, until right here. He hinted strongly at it, but he never actually said, I am the Messiah, until right here. Which I find kind of fascinating. But because what does it gain him to say it now versus before? Right? He knew what saying that would cause.
Yeah, it's the cost of it. His death.
He would usually say, who do you say that I am? Not.
Or or allude to it in other ways, right? But not just outwardly say, I am the Messiah. And now to his accusers, right? I just think that there's some intentionality to it. There's some intentionality to his choices.
Mhm.
Especially since before that, you see how many times it said no one could find any guilt in any
Yeah.
reason to put him to death. Right?
Right, right.
All the false testimony and stuff. So, like this could have, not that it would have, but it could have gone a different way. Are you the son of the blessed one? I'm not. And they were forced to let him go. And he lived a long and fruitful life. You know, like
Yeah,
it was that moment he could have, like, because there was no, they had no case against him,
yeah.
even though they didn't like him and they had all this, you know, evidence that he was causing trouble, but they couldn't put their finger on him. And so he says, I am, and then the wheels are going to turn no matter what, right, at that point.
Mhm.
And their reaction is almost immediate when he says that.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting. I don't, this is something I don't know the answer to this, but when you see the high priest tore his clothes, we've seen that at other places when people are mourning in
Mhm.
the Bible, mourning or upset, that it says they tear their clothes.
Yeah, yeah.
And I'm like, is it literally like, I don't know, ripping your clothes off, or I don't know.
I think you're just tearing a part of your clothing. I don't think it's tearing the robes completely off or anything, but it is ripping material
Yeah.
somewhere on your clothing.
It's just interesting that that's often a something that people do when they're extremely emotional in scripture.
It would take a tremendous amount of strength. I mean, for me to tear something that I have on, or even something in front of me, a piece of fabric,
Right.
you have to have a scissor to get it started. Then you can tear.
Right. But I'm thinking about other places where, you know, someone loses a loved one or something and they tear their clothes
Yeah.
or whatever. It's just an interesting reaction.
Well, could it be that that's just a colloquialism and that it's signifies that they are in difficulty and that they are mourning or whatever? That it's just a way of putting it, and it's not actually tearing clothes.
I don't know. I just find it interesting.
Mhm.
I find that phrase interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
As I said at the beginning, I don't actually know, but I just that comes up in other places in scripture too, the tearing of clothes. Yeah. So let's go on.
Oh, hold on a minute.
Yep.
My book says that in the case of the high priest tearing his clothes, because usually it was just a sign of great grief or shock, but it says in the case of the high priest, it was a form of judicial act expressing the fact that he regarded Jesus's answer as blasphemous. So it was like, okay, this is the final straw, and we've got you now, sort of thing. You
It's
know,
almost like a gavel
right? Yes.
for a modern judge. It's like, all right.
Mhm.
Oh, wow.
Mm.
I'm gonna have to lean on you for the extra explanations, because I have two of my Bibles that I think are really, really great for study, but they're both at church. And for some reason I brought one to church and now I don't, and I'm at home. So I don't have my really good study Bible that has as many notes as there are actually text. While Peter was below in the courtyard, one of the servant girls of the high priest came by. When she saw Peter warming himself, she stared at him and said, "You also were with Jesus, the man from Nazareth." But he denied it, saying, "I do not know or understand what you are talking about." And he went out into the forecourt. Then the cock crowed, and the servant girl, on seeing him, began again to say to the bystanders, "This man is one of them." But again he denied it. Then after a little while, the bystanders again said to Peter, "Certainly you are one of them, for you're a Galilean." But he began to curse and he swore an oath. "I do not know this man you are talking about." At that moment, the cock crowed for the second time. Then Peter remembered that Jesus had said to him, "Before the cock crows twice, you will deny me 3 times." And he broke down and wept.
Poor Peter, you know, you have to feel for him because he's so human. I mean, in that kind of a situation with people being crucified, I mean, put yourself in his situation. Would be really hard to say, yeah, I was there with him. Take me too, you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah.
Well, and then here's the thing. I think for some reason, I'm thinking to the walking on the water. You know, we pick on Peter. I admit I pick on Peter all the time.
Mhm.
Oh, you have little faith. But he actually got out and got on the water, right?
Yeah.
And here, oh, you know, you denied him. But where are the other disciples? They're not there. They ran away.
Yeah.
Mhm.
I mean, he's physically there in the courtyard, unlike most of the other disciples.
Mhm.
You know, so we pick on him because he denied him, but at the same time, the others might have denied him too if they were there, but they ran away.
Which is a major denial.
Right.
Mhm.
So it's kind of, I mean, at least Peter is there and trying.
Mhm.
Peter is so us, you know.
Yes.
Peter is there and trying and fails a lot of the time, but he puts forth an effort, right? So the other, I mean, this is I don't think it says here, but in one of the other gospels, it talks about how they wouldn't have necessarily even let him in, but he had to sort of get somebody to let him into the high priest courtyard or whatever. And when I see servant girl and some of the people that actually accused him and soldiers, and sometimes usually it says it's another hint that he's not just out in the middle of nowhere. He's behind enemy lines in a way, right? He's there. I mean, he's putting himself at risk
Very much so.
to be there. It's not just random people out on the street saying, "Hey, weren't you with that guy that got arrested?" It's much more. He's there with the people that are sort of against Jesus already. Yeah.
It's funny because it says here that the Galileans were readily identified by their dialect, by their speech, and it says Peter's speech showed him to be a Galilean, and his presence among the Judeans in the courtyard suggested he was a follower of Jesus. And I was just thinking, every time I call Excel to find out about the electric bill, I get somebody, and I'm not sure. I have to look at their deal, whether their offices are in Minnesota or Wisconsin, somewhere up there. And the ladies that I talk to always sound just like Carol. And so I was telling Paul that the other day.
Oh,
and
you
I-
know.
Huh?
Oh, you know.
Yeah. And I told Paul that, and I said, you know, they just sound just like Carol. I can always tell where y'all are from. And he goes, well, we're not the one with the accent.
You are, right? Yeah.
Right. Yes.
Mhm. I ran into that once too when I visited Minnesota with a friend. Yeah, and the first person to greet me, he had this little high-pitched voice. And then I realized that even more so recently when trying to adapt to a part in the play, and my voice was pitched far too low. The director needed my voice pitched higher because I was supposed to be a British woman speaking. And that was quite difficult for this a person from the Southwest that had always been taught in public speaking to pitch your voice low so that it could be heard.
Mhm.
Yeah. I typically get asked to pitch my voice higher when I'm in plays for some reason. I can't imagine why. But you make a good point that, and this is something I've mentioned before, that I always thought that all the Jewish people were in one sort of area, and at the time of Jesus, it's almost like they're two separate. There's space in between that's not predominantly Jewish. There's the area of Galilee in the north, and then there's where Jerusalem and stuff is in the south. And so just because the geographical separation, it makes sense that there would be some linguistic differences. Yeah. All right. As soon as it was morning, the chief priests held a consultation with the elders and scribes and the whole council. They bound Jesus, led him away, and handed him over to Pilate. Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" He answered him, "You say so." Then the chief priests accused him of many things. Pilate asked him again, "Have you no answer? See how many charges they bring against you?" But Jesus made no further reply, so that Pilate was amazed. Now at the festival, he used to release a prisoner for them, anyone for whom they asked. Now a man called Barabbas was in prison with the rebels who had committed murder during the insurrection. So the crowd came and began to ask Pilate to do for them according to his custom. Then he answered them, "Do you want me to release for you the king of the Jews?" For he realized that it was out of jealousy that the chief priests had had him over. But the chief priests stirred up the crowd to have him release Barabbas for them instead. Pilate spoke to them again. "Then what do you wish me to do with the man you call the king of the Jews?" They shouted back, "Crucify him." Pilate asked them, "Why? What evil has he done?" But they shouted all the more, "Crucify him." So Pilate, wishing to satisfy the crowd, released Barabbas for them, and after flogging Jesus, he handed him over to be crucified. My Bible says Pilate's role in the death of Judas matches Herod's role in the death of John the Baptist. Remember, Herod liked John the Baptist and didn't want to kill him.
Yeah.
And would often go down to the prison and have conversations with him. But then he was ultimately responsible for his death too. She will not get down. So Pilate seems intrigued by Jesus, but he doesn't think he's done anything wrong.
Yeah, right. I can get upset just reading this part of the scriptures. But I also have the resurrection in my mind, and life today with Jesus. But I wonder how people who don't have that, who don't really recognize the resurrection, and how they survive.
Yeah. Well, we say we are people of the cross, but we also say that we are a resurrection people, and those are not opposites, like some people think they are.
Yeah.
I think by saying we're people of the cross, we're saying that it's not just about. It is about Jesus, but it's not about Jesus. The cross is important because it's about our own frailty, our own humanity, our own failings, right? Our own sin, all that stuff. But we're also people that are resurrection people that says even through all that, we're still loved, right?
Right.
And if you don't have that, that's something that I think that's a fine balance. I think even individual pastors and congregations can tip one way or the other. You can tip into that guilt kind of thing. Like I know some people that have been that come to the Lutheran Church not having been in a similar kind of denomination say, "Oh, you guys are all about guilt, about how bad you are and how sinful you are." That sounds like the cross, right? Like that sounds like being people of the cross. And I think it's, to me, it's not guilty. It's just realistic. We're not perfect, right? Um, but that promise of grace is so important in the Lutheran Church, especially, which is the resurrection side of it, right?
Mhm.
Um, I remember years ago when I was just a kid, we lived in Mescalero, and in Mescalero you had the Dutch Reformed Church or you had the Catholic Church. So, and the Catholic Church there was really cool. And my mom had a friend that came to visit, and so we went with her to the Catholic Church. And that church has all kinds of alcoves with statues and stuff. But the main thing about the Catholic Church that I noticed as a kid was that they always had Jesus on the cross, the crucifixion, And so I asked my mom one day why they did that and why, you know, like the why they worship that way as opposed to just the cross by itself. And she said, well, because we see Jesus as being resurrected, the cross being empty, for like what you were saying, as opposed to uh, Christ on the cross as a sort of a guilt trip. I mean, you got to admit that Catholics are martyrs, made a lot of martyrs there. So anyway, I always just thought of that though, and I just thought of it now when you mentioned that about the cross being a symbol of his grace and of us not worshiping as being crucified, but as being risen.
You would be hard pressed to go into, at least in the LCA Lutheran Church, but probably any kind of Lutheran church, and see a crucifix.
Mhm.
And you'll notice when I wear a cross, I do own one crucifix, but I don't generally wear a crucifix. I'll wear a cross pretty often, but I don't wear a crucifix because we're not people of the crucifixion. We're people of the cross. That's a different thing.
Right.
Right.
And that's how the Episcopal Church is also.
Right.
Yeah. But
yeah, I mean, I think we do. I think we do a little too much Catholic bashing in a sense, because I think it's more, I'm not saying you're doing that.
yeah.
I think it's more complicated than that. It's sort of like the lows are lower and the highs are higher with the Catholic Church, right? They hammer the guilt and the shame and the crucifixion more than we do. But I think there can be some value in that to really feel, to truly really understand is better. They do the Stations of the Cross. I used to attend the Stations of the Cross reenactment when I lived in Florida, and it's powerful. It's brutal. It's hard to watch, even though they're actors and they're it's really difficult. We always read it, but we kind of read it and then we're done with it. Oh, good, we don't have to read that again until next year, right? But we don't feel it quite as deeply, so our low isn't quite as low, right? But I think sometimes you need the low to have the high, and the Catholics do celebrate Easter, right? It's not that they don't celebrate Easter, right?
Right.
So it's almost like if you can dip a little lower, you can go a little higher, and I think that makes it harder. It makes the whole experience harder. I've said that I wish that here's a good example. In the Lutheran Church, if we non-Sunday worship services typically aren't attended super well, but we don't have too many of them that aren't on Sunday. There's a few that some people, Christmas and stuff, but the main ones are Monday, Thursday, and Good Friday. And typically you have maybe a third of the normal Sunday attendance on a Thursday, Friday. Catholic churches, they're full on Thursday and Friday. There's full on Thursday and Friday as they are on Sunday.
Yeah.
And the reason is they kind of get that you got to go through that tough stuff to really be able to celebrate on Easter Sunday. So yeah, I mean, I think it's somewhere in the middle, right? Like I think we don't really need to bash people and make them feel guilty all the time, but at the same time, going through that makes the resurrection that much more beautiful.
Yes.
Effective, whatever. Yeah. So yeah, it's interesting. I preached one time. I preached an Easter sermon on images of the cross, and the church we had several. We had one crucifix that was never up. It was actually stored under the altar in this cabinet.
Hmm.
And we looked at the way the different crosses were, and hi, go away. And so, it just evokes a different image, right?
Mhm.
It's not wrong. It's just different. Like the crucifix I got, interestingly, the crucifix I own, my brother got for me when he was in Italy and Rome. So he got it from Catholic Central, right?
Yeah,
So and it's interesting. Well, let's continue on. Then the soldiers led him into the courtyard of the palace, that is the governor's headquarters, and they called together the whole cohort. Then they clothed him in a purple cloak, and after twisting some thorns into a crown, they put it on him. And they began saluting him, "Hail, King of the Jews!" They struck his head with a reed, spat upon him, and knelt down in homage to him. After mocking him, they stripped him of the purple cloak and put his own clothes on him. Then they led him out to crucify him. There's one other thing I forgot to mention about the last section. I don't remember which gospel it is, but one of the gospels it says that he had 39 lashes. And have you ever heard, it's a pirate term. So I'm relating the gospel to piracy, right? That sounds like a weird thing, but ever hear that 40 lashes and the idea of 40 lashes that was like, it's in one of those pirate like songs, 40 lashes and a dead man's thing or whatever.
yeah.
Because in 40 lashes was considered a death sentence. If you received 40 lashes, that was enough to kill you. With the kind of, it wasn't just a leather whip that had stuff on it to really hurt you. And so, regardless of how many lashes he had, saying 39 means he was whipped to the point of death, right? Which is pretty brutal. And then the purple, there's lots of little hints here. The purple cloak. We know in other places that purple was the color of royalty, and it was very rare and expensive. They're mocking him, but they also had to find a very expensive piece of cloth to put on him, which I find interesting.
Yeah.
It's amazing that the bunch of soldiers would have access to the purple robe.
Purple robe, yeah.
Yeah, robe, yeah.
Yeah.
And my book says that the purple robe was probably an old military cloak whose color suggested royalty. So that's where they would have come up with it, if that's the case.
Yeah. They compelled a passerby who was coming in from the country to carry his cross. It was Simon of Cyrene, the father of Alexander and Rufus. And they brought Jesus to the place called Golgotha, which is the place of the skull. And they offered him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it. And they crucified him, divided his clothes among them, casting lots to decide what each should take. It was 9 o'clock in the morning when they crucified him. The inscription of the charge against him read, "The King of the Jews." And with him they crucified two bandits, one on his right and one on his left. Those who passed by derided him, shaking their heads and saying, "Aha, you who would destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, save yourself and come down from the cross." In the same way, the chief priests, along with the scribes, were also mocking him among themselves and saying, "He saved others, he cannot save himself. Let the Messiah, the King of Israel, come down from the cross now, so that we may see and believe." Those who were crucified with him also taunted him. So, most of you know that I helped write and edit a book while I was still in seminary. That's short stories that are fictional stories, but it's about actual characters in the Bible. And one of the ones that I want to write that I have not written is a conversation between Simon of Cyrene, who this is the only time we hear of him. And in the next section, the centurion standing at the foot of the cross, who says truly this was God's son. I just think their perspectives are really interesting,
Mm-hmm.
and how interesting it would be to have them tell the story of their emotions and their thoughts of what happened that day.
Yeah.
Mhm,
Um,
mhm.
So yeah, it's just I think that would be an interesting conversation, because Simon of Cyrene is it. We don't know exactly why he's there. Some people say he was he was there because it was Passover, so he was a Jew. Some people say he wasn't a Jew. People during Passover would come to Jerusalem to come to the temple, so that makes sense. You know, Jerusalem had a lot more people during this week. Um, um, but it's just interesting. And when you see, this is kind of a little biblical clue. When you see a person's name mentioned and then it says the father of or the son of blank and blank,
Yeah.
that's usually kind of a hint to someone who's reading outside that, oh, I know who that is, right? So it's possible that those other names, Alexander and Rufus, were people known to early Christian communities or something. I don't know, but usually when it's not just, they wouldn't just say, oh, it's that Simon, by it's like, because they didn't have last names, right?
Mm-hmm.
By naming other people that either they're descended from or that are descended from them, they're telling people to make the connection.
Yeah.
Right. That's the guy. Remember Alexander, that guy who came here and spoke to us? Simon, who carried his cross, that's his dad. Like, that's kind of what they're saying, right?
Yeah.
So that's sort of a hint to early readers of this gospel that there's a connection. It's like that certain degrees of separation. Well, you've met Rufus, and Rufus's dad is the guy that carried the cross, or whatever. You know, that's often why you see that kind of reference, and you see it in other places in Scripture as well.
Well, I wonder if anybody has researched those two names.
I'm sure, but I don't. Again,
Yeah,
I'm
know.
saying I don't know a lot right here.
Yeah. Yeah,
Today.
well, that's okay.
I think one of the most interesting biblical research is extra biblical research. The people around the first couple centuries of
Mhm.
Christianity who aren't written about in Scripture, but are connected to either their names from Scripture or they're related to names of Scripture. When I mentioned, I think last week's Bible study, James, the brother of Jesus, is mentioned as an early bishop in the Christian church, the biological brother of Jesus, and he's not really mentioned in Scripture in that way. So it's really interesting to sort of make these connections. John Mark in Acts is possibly the writer of the Gospel of Mark. The other Gospels are, especially Matthew and John, we're not totally sure who wrote them. But John Mark, when you see John Mark traveling with Paul, you're like, oh, cool. Like, you can make that connection, right?
Yeah.
And after Paul, probably after Paul was martyred, is when John Mark or somebody writes the Gospel of Mark. So it's neat to see those connections that they aren't necessarily laid out for us in the Scripture, like who are Alexander and Rufus. But I'm sure that someone somewhere has made some kind of genealogical or historical connection there. Yeah. Every word of Scripture has been studied. I mean, pretty much. So.
Yeah. Well, can we go backwards a second?
Yeah.
Back when they gave him the choice of Jesus and Barabbas, and I had always assumed that Barabbas, because I had read that, was like a really bad guy. He was a thief, a murderer, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
But here it says he was a member of the Zealots, which were a revolutionary Jewish group in the uprising. So says nothing nothing from other sources is known about this insurrection, which he was supposedly part of, though Mark speaks of it as if it was well known. So, and under the Romans, a lot of those little revolts were, very common. And I had always thought that maybe Barabbas was just a crook, just and maybe he was a bad revolutionary, but I just found that kind of enlightening that he was not what I thought he was, according to
And
this.
not a murderer for not, yeah. I've heard that too. So one of Jesus's disciples, Simon, not Simon Peter, but there's another Simon, is also known as Simon Zealots, Simon Zelotes, which is from that group of zealots. So it's an interesting, yeah. So there was a group of people that were Jewish people that were really looking for the overthrow of Rome.
Mhm.
And I think a lot of the disciples at least sympathized with them if they weren't officially part of that movement.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think the implication is that Barabbas may have been a murderer, but he murdered somebody in an uprising against Rome.
Right. Mhm.
So justifiable murder? I mean, I don't know.
Well, according to them, it probably was.
Right. Yeah, I had heard that too. It doesn't really say that in the scripture here, but I think it may in one of the other gospels sort of give a little bit more about Barabbas.
Makes it a little bit more understandable that the crowds would say, give us Barabbas, rather than give us Jesus.
Well, especially when you consider that I really firmly believe that the disciples, at least, and the other followers of Jesus really wanted Jesus to rise up against the government.
Yeah,
And when he basically refused to do it,
yeah,
well, if Jesus won't, maybe we'll get Barabbas to do it.
yeah.
Yeah, I hadn't thought of it that way, but you're right, Judy. That does make it seem more understandable.
Yeah.
And I always pose the question this way: which is a more effective revolution?
Yeah.
Rising up against a government that has a ton more power than you, or becoming a martyr, and a few hundred years later, that same empire would convert to Christianity,
Mhm. Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Mhm.
Like it may have, Jesus was playing the long game.
Yeah.
Last night we were watching this show about, it was the Lost Ark and all that. But what they were concentrating on, part of it was in 70 AD when the Romans destroyed the temple and Jerusalem, and they had taken everything. And it made me think about, what we've been reading about, and how the Jews definitely had a reason to want to overthrow the Romans, because eventually the Romans were going to squish them, and they didn't know that in 200 years later that the Romans were all going to be Catholic or Christian, whatever,
Yeah.
So the immediacy of the Roman oppression was really very real to them,
This is gonna sound confusing, but the Romans were on some levels they were actually very humane,
Uh-huh.
and I'm not just saying that. I'm not defending the Romans.
Mm-mm.
One way that we know that the Romans were surprisingly humane was when we talk about like oppression of religion. For the most part, most of the time under Roman rule, both before and after Jesus, you could worship however you want, wherever you want, whatever you want. They didn't care so much. However, on the flip side, the Jews had been under different rule before the Romans. It was the Greeks, and before that it was Babylonians and others. The Romans were the first that really taxed them heavily. So they had freedom of religion, but they essentially took a lot of their money, right? So it was sort of financial well-being that was really rough, was really hard on them. So when we talk about like religious persecution by the Romans, it was hit and miss. There were times that the Romans persecuted people for religious purposes. Even the early Christians were sort of tolerated until they kind of got out of line, but it also depended on which emperor was in charge. There were times that under one emperor, everyone was free to do whatever they wanted, and another emperor would say, no, 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 everybody has to be this religion or this religion, or these certain religions are outlawed. So I think the bigger reason for wanting to overthrow was the financial reason, not the faith reason. I think we sometimes in our modern context think it's about, well, they wouldn't let him be Christian or they wouldn't let him be Jewish. I'm like, well, maybe. I mean, it's not as cut and dry to that, but the bigger thing is the financial security. You know, that they had not ever been taxed. Jewish people had not ever been taxed to the level that they were being taxed at the time of Jesus. And as we know from other readings, the tax collectors would take a cut on top of that. So people were, you know, losing their livelihood because of these taxes. And as we know, ironically, when we started, before we recorded, I talked a little bit about my own issues with the taxes. You know, when you are, you know, when it's your livelihood, when it's your ability to put food on your table and feed your children, I think that was the rationale for them wanting to overthrow Rome. And it's not that, I just have to say that because a lot of people think that the part of that feeling was about religious persecution. And while it existed, it wasn't the primary reason, I don't think. Right.
Well, this article also said that the temple was incredibly rich because that's where they had stored all of the money that they had collected from the people that had, you know, the Jews. It was saying that the Jews had to give 1 shekel per person to the temple every year. And I don't know what a shekel was, but I think that it must have been a lot of money accumulated there in the temple itself, because that's where they kept it. So when the Romans destroyed it, they took everything. They took, you know, all of the artifacts plus all of the gold or the money that had been collected over the years. So I have the feeling that the priests were managing to collect quite a bit of the money from the common people also.
Well, that's separate from the taxes from the Romans.
Right. But the Romans were looking.
One of the significant things about Jesus overturning the tables in the temple is that I think I might have even mentioned this in a sermon at some point. You know, their worship required sacrifices of animals, and let's say you could buy a dove in the regular marketplace for $1. So if you could buy a dove and sacrifice it at home, and that was your worship, and you're out $1. But no, that doesn't work. The temple priest said, no, that's not how it works. You can't do it there. You got to do it at the temple. So they came with their $1, but now they can't use their regular money that's outside the temple, so they need to exchange it. Well, for them to get $1 worth of temple money, they needed $2 worth of other money, right? And then the dove was actually $3 because it was a special dove that the temple had, right? So now they're using what would have been $6, right? $1 outside, but $6 for this dove. And the people that were changing the money, the people who were providing the animals for sacrifice in the temple were all getting a cut. And the temple priests were getting a cut. So all the way through, what would have cost you $1 now costs $6. That's pretty big markup, right? And the priesthood, the people that led the temple, it was more, it was almost like it was a position of privilege, right? Land and title and wealth kind of came along with it. So it wasn't like an election. You didn't get elected to be a priest. You got, if you gave enough money and you greased enough palms and you made enough people happy, you might be able to be in the priestly order. If you became the high priest, you got even more privilege and wealth and stuff. So yeah, it was a good deal to be in the priestly council, and then the high priest. Yeah, I mean, it was the equivalent of, you know, getting a pretty good 7-figure salary, you know, like today. So it wasn't as much about, even though they were sort of the judges of the people, the judges I use quote loosely, it wasn't that they were the best judges. It was that they were the ones that made the right bribes to the right people to get into positions, or they were related to somebody who did.
Yeah.
We know it says in a few times that, in fact, Caiaphas, who was the high priest at the time of Jesus, his father-in-law had been the high priest. I think it's that way. His father-in-law Annas had been the high priest previously.
Yeah.
So sometimes it was just passed on that way, you know, within the family or whatever. Yeah. So yes, you're right. They got wealth, but that was even separate from the wealth of that was they taken from them by the Roman taxation. Totally separate. So yeah, they're and they were required to worship in the temple, and to worship the temple cost money.
Mhm.
It would almost be like us standing at the door and says, you can only come in if you give us $1,000 to worship.
Well, maybe that wouldn't be such a bad idea.
We could use it. But yeah, so it was more about making money than it was about
Yeah.
whatever it was supposed to be, right?
Saving souls, right? Yeah. So like evangelists today.
I have a very stubborn puppy dog next
Is
to me.
Pat still here?
I see the
Yeah.
top of her head.
Oh, there.
I'm here.
Okay.
When it was noon, darkness came over the whole land until 3 in the afternoon. At 3 o'clock, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? When some of the bystanders heard it, they said, listen, he's calling for Elijah. And someone ran, filled a sponge with some sour wine, put it on a stick, and gave it to him to drink, saying, wait, let us see whether Elijah will come to take him down. Then Jesus gave a loud cry and breathed his last. And the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. Now when the centurion who stood facing him saw that in this way he breathed his last, he said, truly this man was God's son. There were also women looking on from a distance. Among them were Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James, the younger, and of Joseph and Salome. These used to follow him and provided for him when he was in Galilee, and there were many other women who had come up with him to Jerusalem.
It always amazes me that temple, that drapery was torn from the top down to the bottom. That, to me, I always wondered, was that the Lord himself doing that? God.
I also, I have a hard time, I've preached on this and I've heard other people preach on this. It's hard not to see it as, if you understand how the temple is organized, that tearing of the curtain of the temple is shockingly symbolic, because there was an outer courtyard where anybody who was not Jewish could worship, and they did. Sometimes non-Jews were there to worship. Then there was the court of the women, which is what you think it is, right? Which was an inner court. So it's like layers of an onion, right? The next layer was the court of the women. Then was the court of the, I think it wasn't court of the men, it was something else, right? But it was where, so you couldn't go, if you're a woman, you couldn't go into that next level, that next layer inside. And then there was the court of the priests, and then there was the Holy of Holies. So in the Holy of Holies, only the high priest could go into. And that's where supposedly the Ark of the Covenant was. That curtain separated the Holy of Holies from the rest. So symbolically, but also literally, which is important, separated what they believed was the very essence of God from the people. So for that to be torn is amazingly symbolic, because the way they worship is, was only for some people. Only some people could get that close to God, and other people had to be more at a distance or more in outer layers. And so that to be torn. And yeah, it is interesting because if it's I'm just the mechanics of it are interesting. If it's a 20-foot, 30-foot high curtain, how does it get torn in two from the top to the bottom?
Yeah, yeah,
Like, it's interesting.
yeah. Symbolically, it was torn by God himself.
Mhm.
I also find the thing that hit me that I guess I never really realized. We have a little phrase from Aramaic, which I don't know if there are other pieces of Aramaic is a dead language that we don't know much about anymore. But Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani is Aramaic, which
Oh.
Jesus spoke.
Mhm.
Um, uh, and people say, listen, he's calling for Elijah. He's not actually calling for Elijah.
Mm-mm.
They were confused the word Eloi with Elijah, which is interesting. I never made that connection.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Well, and go back to the ripping of the curtain. I had never thought of it this way, but what it says here is that the tearing of the curtain indicated that Christ had entered heaven itself for us, so that we too may enter God's very presence. So, in other words, like you were saying, only special people could enter that area of the temple. Now that the curtain is totally torn, everyone is eligible to enter into God's presence.
yeah.
Wow.
And I
Mhm.
never ever thought about it like that before.
That's a more of that's a theological perspective more than a kind of historical perspective, but I like it.
Mhm.
I
Yeah.
mean, it's kind of what I said already. I tend
Right.
to lean into the historical, but I
Right.
like that. I like that way of thinking for sure.
That phrase in Aramaic, doesn't that come from one of the Psalms? Psalm 20. What?
Mine says Psalm 22. Yeah.
Okay, that's what I thought.
Yeah. And it's probably a minor point, but I'm betting that Jesus also spoke at least some Greek.
Mhm.
He may have primarily spoken Aramaic among his disciples, but in some places he wouldn't have been understood speaking just in Aramaic. So I imagine he spoke some Greek, the language of empire. Otherwise, how would Pilate talk to him? How would other, there'd be other places he wouldn't be heard. It's an interesting thought. Like,
Yeah.
I'm
I kept,
assuming,
when I was growing up, I kept hearing that so much of the New Testament was written in Aramaic, but the more I keep reading, I have discovered that it was actually that the common language was definitely Hebrew.
yeah, but most of the New Testament is written in Greek.
The New Testament was in Greek.
Yep.
Okay.
Almost all the New Testament.
So they went from Hebrew to Greek to English, and that's why we have trouble understanding.
The original language of the New Testament was Greek, actually. So,
Yeah.
and we don't have any of the original text, but we've got some early texts. And so, one thing that you do and when you're in seminary, you're required to take Greek, and translating the closest Greek we have into the English is interesting. I try to, I don't do it every week, but almost every week I look at the Greek, because sometimes the words that translation is interpretation. So sometimes the words that are chosen are not always the best choices. So it's kind of interesting sometimes to see, well, why did they choose that word instead of this word? Sorry, especially if they chose. Sometimes that same word will be translated everywhere else 100 times one way, and then one time it'll be chosen this other way. And like, why did they this one time choose that, right? The example I often use is when we talk about Mary being a virgin, the word translated as virgin almost everywhere else in the Bible is translated young girl. Why did the translators choose virgin instead of young girl when almost everywhere else it's young girl? And my guess is it's not that she wasn't a virgin. I mean, that's kind of, that's our belief that she was a virgin, but to me, it doesn't affect Jesus' ability to be God.
Yeah.
But the Roman emperor was believed to be born of a virgin. So whether or not Jesus was born of a virgin is not, the choice was made so that it would be sort of in competition with the emperor in terms of kinghood, right? Because if she's just a young girl and he's not born of a virgin, then it takes something away from his, for people that would be reading it that knew the emperor was supposed to be born of a virgin, it would take something away from his ability to be on the same par with the emperor.
Mhm.
So that's a translation thing, right? And so I often wonder about, it's always interesting to see why they chose why they made certain choices in the translation. And it goes to this, because I don't think there's anywhere else in Aramaic specifically that's anywhere else in scripture except for this sentence.
That what?
So this is the only sentence I think in all of scripture that's written in Aramaic.
Oh, okay.
So why did they say, this is my question, why did they just say, and then Jesus cried out with a loud voice in Aramaic,
Yeah.
my God, why are you forsaken? Or even skip the Aramaic. And then Jesus cried out with a loud voice, my God, why have you forsaken me? Part of it is because they thought they heard Eloi and thought that meant was Elijah.
Oh.
Right?
Well,
Why else would they do it? Because if they skip that part, listen, he's calling for Elijah, like, where is Elijah in my God, why have you forsaken me? So the reason they put the Aramaic in there is to show why people were misunderstanding him.
Oh, okay.
It's interesting, right? It was a choice too, right?
well, are the according to my Bible, it says that Jesus was quoting Psalm 22.
Yep.
And the very beginning of it is, my God, why have you forsaken me? But at the very beginning of that, which I had never seen before, I guess they all have a little bit of that. It says, for the director of music, to the tune of the doe and the morning, a psalm of David.
Yeah.
So
So one thing that's probably important to know, I wasn't planning on going there, but you forced my hand, Nancy.
sorry.
The Psalms, kind of like there's other books, like Isaiah is the best example, but there's other books that when it's written, they weren't written all at the same time. So when it's written could have an impact on why that response is that way. And so when you say, my God, why have you forsaken me? It to me, it kind of, I'm going to see if we have a timeline for that specific one. Sometimes it parallels specific times in the Jews' history. I'm looking. So the first books 1 through 41, Psalms 1 through 41 were in the first book. Probably many different authors, most of whom are not identified. It's often attributed to David or to Solomon, other people, but boy, I'm saying I don't know a lot today. But there are people that associate different Psalms with different time periods in the Jews, and so my God, why have you forsaken me? It's interesting to see, like, what are they crying out against, right? Because whatever they're crying out against is probably a little bit different from what Jesus is crying out against, but it's interesting that he picks that at that moment. And it's if you think about it, just even with the English, it's an interesting statement to say, why have you forsaken me, God? Why are you putting me through this?
Yeah.
This pain. Well, we're near the end of chapter 15, so we may as well finish it here, even though we're a little over time. When evening had come, since it was the day of preparation, that is the day before the Sabbath, Joseph of Arimathea, a respected member of the council, who was also himself waiting expectantly for the kingdom of God, went boldly to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. And Pilate wondered if he were already dead, and summoning the centurion, he asked him whether he had been dead for some time. When he learned from the centurion that he was dead, he granted the body to Joseph. Then Joseph brought a linen cloth, and taking down the body, wrapped it in the linen cloth, and laid it in the tomb that had been hewn out of the rock. He then rolled a stone against the door of the tomb. Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of Joseph, saw where the body was laid.
And um, when Joseph of Arimathea did that, was it strips of linen or a single sheet of linen in which they wrapped his body? This question kept coming to me recently. Was it that? But then also in the other Gospels, it talks about at that same time, they used 75 or 100 pounds of spices.
Mm-hmm.
And yet later, the women came back on Easter Sunday morning, what we call Easter Sunday morning, again to anoint. So there's confusion there. But I am confused as, was it a single sheet or a whole bunch of strips of cloth?
Well, I think it implies that it's a single sheet, but I will tell you of another case where it very specifically says it was not a single sheet, and that is when Lazarus is laid. It says
Right.
he was wrapped in strips of cloth.
Mhm.
And so the tradition was right when they died. My Bible actually says this too, but right when they died, like within the first day, they treated it with spices, they wrapped it in cloth, and then they waited for the body essentially to decompose until they could, which would take a year or more. They would come and they would effectively treat the bones in a different way, and then it would be in its permanent burial. So it would sort of get time to decompose first. So why they're coming? Maybe they didn't finish the jobs when he was first laid in the tomb, and so they came 3 days later to finish
Mm-hmm.
what they had started. I don't. It's a good question. I don't really know.
Yep.
Because
Mhm.
hypothetically, it would have been sealed, and that would have been it for a year.
Yeah. But the reason I was asking is I was reading one commentary or heard one commentary, can't remember which,
Oh,
that when on resurrection morning, that the what he was wrapped in and with all these spices and all was still in the same shape. But then, of course, in the Gospel of John, it talks about the cloth that was around Jesus' face was folded separate.
yeah,
So
yeah. I mean, and the
was it still in the shape of his body, or was it a pile of cloth?
the Gospels are going to disagree too.
Yeah,
I'm reading something else here
interesting.
that says that part of the reason that they came back was probably because it was right before the Sabbath, and
Uh-huh.
the actual preparation of the body took many hours, and they probably didn't have enough time before Sabbath started.
Mhm.
It doesn't say that, but I think it kind of implies that. It says Joseph and the two women want the work of getting the body into the tomb to be done before the Sabbath starts on Friday evening. And then in the next section, it says Sabbath ended Saturday evening. The women purchase spices then and then go to the tomb on Sunday evening. So probably they put the body in the tomb with just the cloth or maybe minimal spices, and they plan on doing the full and complete job once Sabbath is over, because they're not allowed to do that work on a Sabbath.
Mm-hmm.
Starts, assuming we assume it starts in just a few hours, so it probably wasn't enough time for them to do it the right way. I'm making a guess, but I think it's a pretty educated guess.
Yeah.
So because the next section, they came very early after the Sabbath with the spices. So,
But then they were asking themselves in this, who will roll the stone away? So there were 3 women there. How are they going to roll the stone away anyway? What were they thinking?
Right. Good thing God did it for him, right?
Yeah, right.
But the guards were expected to be there though.
Yeah.
What?
The guards were
Guards.
Oh,
to be there.
Did you notice in Mark there doesn't say anything about guards being there?
No, it doesn't.
Oh.
That's why I was wondering.
Oh, so we only have I'm not going to finish. We'll finish next week because I want to have some conversation about this next week. But if I say this almost every week, I'm going to sound like a heretic again, and just understand I'm going to sound like a heretic. But if Mark is a resource for Luke and Matthew, and the original version says there were no guards, why would they add the guards in? Were they there or were they not there? We don't know if they were there or not, but why would they highlight that they were there?
Mhm.
Because they didn't want it to look like the body was just stolen,
Ah,
right? Because Mark poses more questions than answers sometimes. Well, there's no guards and the stones rolled away and the body is not there. Well, who stole the body?
Mhm.
Because in Mark, in the original or ending of Mark, there's an empty tomb and there's someone there to tell them he's been raised, but there's no appearance of Jesus to the disciples after.
Mhm.
The only evidence we have of the resurrection is the young man in a white robe telling them he's been raised, he's not here. End of story. Right? So I'm not saying that there weren't guards there. I'm saying that Mark and Matthew and Luke highlighted the fact that the guards were there, so it wasn't that the body had just been taken,
Yeah,
which makes sense,
right.
right?
But they did wrote those afterwards if they're correct about using Mark for their for their source. So by then they wanted to make sure that there was no argument about whether Jesus's body was stolen or not. They had to prove that it wasn't by saying that there were still guards there.
Right. And then in Mark, as we'll talk about next week, there were 2 additions that were written after the fact to sort of clear some of those questions up in Mark.
Mhm.
So it's just interesting. Well, let's finish here and we will talk about the whole book and chapter 16 next week.
Okay.
And then we will
Thank
be
you.
done. Thank you all.
Thank you.
I'm going to stop the recording. I keep forgetting to post it. I record it and then I forget to post it, but I'm going to post it as soon as I'm done here. So.